if you're not a resident, here's gender pie chart. Are you Hispanic, Latino? What is your race? I mean, we're getting 89.8% white respondents. Age group, very nice mix here. 3 issues you're most concerned about in your community. I mean, if we look at the top 3, we're looking at burglaries, drug abuse, and sexual assault at this point, and that might change with additional responses. Do you feel safe from crime outside alone during the day? If we combine the purple to a great extent and a lot and look at that response, I mean, that's a really, really high response. Same thing for at night, you combine the purple and the green and look at it, and you're looking at over 50%. You were about almost 60, right? 55. What extent have your feelings of safety from crime increase, decrease, or stay the same? You can see a lot of people are staying the same. And then I would just recommend that we look at the next question. This one here, if you had contact with an officer in EGPD during the past 12 months, no contact within 12 months is 57%. So, if we look at that question before we look at the other questions that they're answering, it would be important. But, we're getting a nice response rate. It could be better. And the responses, we don't want to spend a lot of time digging into the data now because it could change. If we get another 200 responses, I mean, these could shift not at all, or they could shift dramatically, but we're getting a good response.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Tina, what about the police department survey?
So the police department survey, we're at 21 responses.
That's good.
That is good. So
that's a good number.
Yeah.
So we should do maybe one more push to promote it and then wrap it up.
I think so. We never talked about a target response number that we got. 245 is in some ways very surprisingly positive.
Oh, we could live with that if we had to.
We can live with it, but it would be nice to see a little bit of an increase.
Yeah. And Dan Wagner and Kelly Shira were going to get the PIG students after they got their projects done. So I think I'll ping Dan in the morning on that one. Megan did a Nixle alert. We have it pinned on the Facebook page, so it's always at the top. But does anybody have any thoughts on how we could do one more push to promote it?
I think the PIG teachers is a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should definitely be done.
Yep. And I sent it out to everyone in town hall, said, to show your relatives, your friends. I don't know. I mean, Tina, the truth be told, that's a good number. I mean,
it's a good number, and it's really slowed down as we anticipated.
Yeah.
The first week was the big rush, and I mean, I think this past week has been maybe 45 or 50 responses. So.
Yeah, it's slowing down.
It's slowing down.
So once the PIG classes weigh in, have we decided if we're going to wrap it up on the end of next week, or?
Yeah, we did talk
February 5th.
We had talked about February 5th. We have a meeting next Tuesday, the 2nd. If we stay on schedule for a meeting, I would suggest that we close it then, so that we can.
On the 2nd.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that gives us an extra week of looking at it. If we just push this week and see what we get.
Okay.
We'll also touch base with our officers and dispatchers again as a reminder, if anyone's still planning on filling it out.
And what was the total number of responses that we could get, Chief, for the police one?
We have 23, 43, like 40. Well, part-timers like less than 50.
Okay.
With our part-time dispatchers as well.
Okay.
Between officers and dispatchers.
So I think we'd want to probably get closer to 50% response rate if possible.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
I will send that out in the morning. I wrote myself a note.
And Tina, do you have a sense of how you want to analyze and present it? Do you want to both work on it? Do you want to do a draft of that? How we're going to include it in a report?
I mean, however you want. I mean, I can present it any way you want.
Well, if that's the case, then we should present it the way you want.
Okay.
No, but seriously, you know what?
Meeting adjourned.
So, I'm willing to look at drafts and all of that, but you're pretty good at that stuff.
Okay, yeah.
All
But I mean,
right.
I think that the step in between that is that our committee really needs to look at that data.
Yes,
That
yes.
presentation to me is almost more important.
Yeah. So if next Tuesday we stop the survey, then the following Tuesday, we'll have a conversation about it
Yeah.
with this group.
And we
That'll
can,
give everyone a chance to look at it, figure it out.
yeah, if we close it next Tuesday, I can send out the results after the meeting, giving people a week to look at the data.
Yep.
And then have a conversation.
Yeah, we'll go after it then. Okay. The second thing I wanted to cover tonight were policies. One of the things that interested me in what happened is when I originally did that long list, one of the reasons I did that is because of my fear that there would be interrelationships all over the place. And I think from the email traffic and John and Chief, thank you so much for your responsiveness. I think people, as they read certain policies, did pick up on those links and wanted to follow them. So the question is for tonight, I mean, we picked 4 policies. Is there any one, let's start with one of them and just get a sense of how policies work, how we responded to them. Does anyone have one? I mean, for me, the use of force was the one that kind of hit me between the eyes. But
Can we start with an easier one, Jack, though? Because I think you're right that's the one that really, we had so many other links to, but can we just to review, could we just start with one of the ones that didn't seem as complex, just to sort of get the process underway?
Where do you want to go?
I don't know, maybe, the community relations one might be a simpler one.
Okay.
Or to start with, maybe.
Okay.
I would agree.
Just so we can figure out what we're doing with something a little easier.
Yeah. So did people use the rubric?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the general response to, first off, reading a policy like this? Because it's kind of its own genre of writing.
Yeah.
Comments on just the overall, what the experience was to try to understand and critique this.
It was definitely, I found it a little challenging to critique because I kept trying to put myself in okay, I'm reading this as being part of the agency and not, it's harder to read it as an outsider, I think, but in education, and I turn a page and I'd go, oh, you have to think of that as part of this whole policy. And, oh, I didn't consider that as part of this policy. So there was a lot of that too, for me. It widened my perspective for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Any other general comments?
I think I had the same reaction as Robin. It was challenging to read the policies, and it was, really illuminating because of all the things that I didn't think would fall under a policy like that I had that exact same reaction. The rubric, by the way, was really helpful. So thank you for that, because it gave some, structure to how we're looking at them. I guess that's it.
Okay. And does anybody have, let me ask this question, and I'm going to stumble through the question because I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying. But one of the things we talked about was how these policies will factor into recommendations in a plan. And as you were reading this one, for example, was there anything that looked to you like a place where we could talk about maybe something that could improve it, or you know, and I had some questions, Chief. Do we have a community advisory committee?
That was my
Oh,
question.
right. Well, so this is a new policy, obviously, and that is not something we have, and that's something
Yeah.
in my rubric that I noted that plays into the executive order, and this, in addition to the survey,
Yeah.
that they talk about. So
Yeah.
that's something that we've never done informally or formally. Informally, we talk to people, but not formally, I should say, gathering data. So that's something that John and I, when we went and did through the rubric, both noted that, things that we can do to improve. And
Yeah.
obviously with the policy, it makes it very easy having it spelled out for us.
Yes, yeah, the policy shows you what you have and what you don't have. But something like that, I think, is the kind of recommendation that can be made
Correct.
as part of this plan. But I also, just because I always concerned about the fiscal stuff and the staffing needs, you know, there's a number of places where there are annual reports and, you know, reports to the community and all that. And every single one of them looks like a good idea, but we probably don't have the bandwidth to do. I mean, if we come up with a plan that just is bureaucratic overkill for the department, that's going to be a problem. But this community advisory committee seems like it could be pretty good. So were there other things in this policy that people want to talk about, or things that were missing, or things that they liked? Ingrid,
Oops, sorry.
Ingrid, you want to say? You looked like you wanted to say something.
I was just like, for all of the policies, I was just kind of curious for the chief and you guys, like, do you think it's working? Do you think there are strengths and weaknesses to it, like as you do your job, or do these policies do what you need them to do? That's kind of, you know, because it's like kind of abstract to read about them, you know?
And we do, and they're always evolving. You know, when different, like I think we talked, you know, a few times that, you know, different case law comes out and things change, especially particularly the use of force, which it's probably best, like you said, we started with this because that's a heavier topic. Things always change. You know, we add programs, we add things that we do at the police department. So like in our community relations under member responsibilities, just there's different things that, you know, we have fulfilled in the past year that necessarily we weren't doing as often. And now, you know, between casual and consensual contacts, we have all our COPS events, well, barring COVID. So things like that. So we're always tweaking them and looking, and now having these policies as structured as they are, it kind of gives us a checkbox to say, hey, are we hitting all these key things? So it's definitely helpful for us.
To reiterate, you know, you're asking cops whether or not it's, you know, this is something that we can improve on, or, you know, is it working? In my experience, particularly on other ends of law enforcement, you know, there's never you've reached the point and you're doing great. There's always something you can tweak. There's always something you have to revisit. Just because something went right doesn't mean you can't learn something from it and change it, you know, and that is kind of how all these policies live and breathe. The problem is as you'll see, is there's so many of them that, you know, you have to kind of pick your poison, so to speak, and deal with the big ones and jump on the other ones as you can.
Yep. Yeah, one of the questions I had, and it ran through a lot of what we're doing here, is this concept of procedural justice. Because when we think about community policing, we have events where police, you know, do things with the community. They get to know people. You know, there's all kinds of programs. We do the car seat stuff and handing out ice cream coupons to kids who are wearing helmets while they're riding bikes. There's all that kind of stuff. But procedural justice is a part of community, a really important part of community policing. And what it addresses is what happens during an interaction between a police officer and a suspect. So that you're not, you know, a kid in the park having an ice cream cone. You are, you know, being hauled out of Walmart for having stolen something. And so the other part of community relations, because this doesn't seem like a huge problem to us. It certainly is in Albany. But the question is, what's the confidence level in the police when you're engaged in an interaction of a potentially criminal nature? So I think this policy could use, it could be strengthened in a couple of places by adding some of the procedural justice stuff, because it broadens the definition of what community policing is. And it has to do with trust. I think the survey will help. Both surveys will help with that. But that's one thing I thought about that. And I actually thought it in the very beginning in policy, it could be an addition. What's there is 341.2. What's there is good, but a sentence or two could be added. And I don't know if that's part of what a plan should look like. I don't know if that's a conversation I should just write down my thoughts and submit them to the department and say, you know, do with these as you will, or whether it makes sense to put it in a plan.
And without off the top of my head knowing the number, but I'm thinking some of that is addressed in some of our other policies as well. This is more geared towards the community, more casual engagements.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we'll see some of that addressed, maybe not using those specific words, procedural justice, but in some other policies, which John and I can look into and share.
Yeah, it's all over the use of force policy.
Yes.
Definitely in there. I'm sure it's elsewhere as well. So
yeah, no doubt.
In the introduction, purpose and scope, you allude to other policies that may have an effect on the community relations policy. I would suggest that we may want to add policy number 401 to that list. And that may also speak to what Jack just raised.
Yeah.
I also like to remind the committee, and I know Jack and Chief, you know this, that accreditation process that the department went through, and I'm so proud of the department and you, Jack, for pushing that police professionals come in and look at these policies. And those police professionals are usually always chiefs, at least chiefs.
Yeah.
So they have undergone a great deal of scrutiny. That's not to say we can't improve and they're not involving. But I just don't want the committee to feel that we're looking at it for the first time.
Yeah, I think that's right. Bethlehem is accredited and they make a really big deal of that in their draft. Yeah. And at some point in our report, we're going to have to do an overview of the police department, how many officers there are, how they're organized, how many calls we get, all kinds of different things that have to come into an overview. And accreditation is part of that. That was a big move. Jim Kondo looked worse for wear when we were done, but it was worth doing.
Yeah,
and so I'm sorry.
10 years off my life. It took 10 years off my life when I went through it.
Yeah, it was something. Of course, I just had to sit in the supervisor's office and get reports and yell at people, so it was easy for me. The other thing about this policy is the survey. I think we have a prototype in the survey we just did.
Absolutely.
And I think that, we've shown, this is the royal we, which means me and Tina. Tina has shown here how, I don't want to say easy because she worked hard and did a good job on this, but this can be done. It's not it's not a bridge too far. So that's one of the things we can talk about when we get to the recommendations for the plan. But that also raises the issue if we only looked at in depth at 4 policies, and in the one we decided was the simple one, we have 2 recommendations. Do we need to take a closer look at policies than we're taking? we don't have that much time, but just as a question.
I guess I had sort of the opposite reaction, Jack, that when, I appreciated what Roger just said, because I know when I started looking at the policies, I felt like, wow, these are really, I don't know that they cover everything, and I'm glad that we're looking at them, but I felt like, wow, they're really well done. And I felt a great sense of confidence as I read through the policies that I would never have imagined that level of confidence. I mean, it's all in the execution, right? And so I'm confident that the chief and assistant chief are going to carry out the policies as well. But I ended up feeling, very, and I guess the word is confident about the depth of the policies. They were more extensive and deeper than I had imagined. So I just want to say that up front.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. But within them, there are places to look. It's like this community advisory committee. And I mean, the other thing we'll have to do is when we get a draft of recommendations, we're going to have to look at it and see if it's, if we've just done too much. Because the other side of the coin is I don't want to produce a plan that we can't really do. Like I'd like it to be let me put it this way. The Bethlehem draft report comes right out and says, Black Lives Matter, people of color have been abused by the Bethlehem Police Department, and every police department needs huge, major improvements in the way they deal with minorities, the way they deal with sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. I don't see us taking that exact slant. But as we talked briefly at the beginning, written into something called the Police Reform and Reinvention Collaborative is the idea that this is a critical look, and that in the report we can find a lot of ways to say we have a great department, and and the results of the survey can frame that. But we haven't done our job if we don't at least take a very close and careful look at some of these issues. And community policing is one that, for the nature of our community and the nature of our police department, community policing is really important. It's not important like in the South End in Albany or in Arbor Hill, where it's life or death, but it is important in terms of, as Tina was reviewing the resource book, what are the functions of the police? What do we need our police to do for our community? And so community policing is important. But I want to put that, if you will, bias on the table that Bethlehem did. I mean, when they looked at traffic stops, they had more people of color who were stopped, and they really beat themselves up. And by beat themselves up, I mean the politicians beat up their department, and they did fall back on. They have a new chief, and she's progressive, and she's tasked with improving all this stuff. So it comes down to how we write this thing.
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't want to interrupt any of our committee members. I'd rather hear from them than speak myself. But, just to build upon what we've been talking about so far, I mean, Roger made a really important point that it is an accredited department. And Maria made a really good point that we, after reviewing these policies, I think our confidence has increased, and our questioning on if the policy is absent or present has decreased based on what I'm hearing from people. So I think, we have to look at our recommendations for East Greenbush. If we have to decide if we want to do a micro recommendation or a macro recommendation, a micro being, we want to change the wording in a policy, or a macro to say, we hope that the department will put in place a process that is sustainable and routinely looks at these issues to make sure that they are in the right policies and that the policies are interacting in the right ways. So I looked at this exercise as a way to understand the way a policy is written and that the content is there. I didn't look at it at that micro level of, should I be saying in this policy, this wording needs to be included, because I think we could spend years, and that's what Lexapol is doing. So I'm hoping that we'll move towards that macro idea of these broad implementation oriented recommendations of routinely looking at things, implementation process of plan something, do it, study it, see if it works, and then act and revise it. So feedback on that?
If I may, as we had mentioned earlier, thank you, Tina. I appreciate that comment first off, because as we were implementing from our initial accreditation standards and policies that we had in place and reviewing policies before we distribute them to the officers or bring them to our, the content experts, look, we saw this policy. In our old policy, we did not have a advisory committee section. We did not have a survey committee. These are things that we knew with the executive order coming, that this fits what they're looking for with the community involvement. So we chose, because these, other than where you see where it says state and federal, and that a lot of it is discretion. You can, via our discretion, what we choose to leave in or not leave in. And we chose to leave this because we feel that, maybe an ongoing thing, even just say if it was this group of people once, 4 times a year or something, we could randomly get together and look at some random policies and continue this committee portion that's cited in the one section, or there's some reviews and just see how things are going. Or if you want to revisit a policy that we've looked at and see if things have changed. But we chose, as the chiefs and the training coordinators and the sergeants, to leave these sections in here when we were transitioning from old to new policies, because we felt it was important in light of what's going on in the world and full transparency and disclosure on everything. So I feel like we did a portion already by doing that, and I'm happy with that. And I was hoping that by everybody looking at it, you'll see that that's part of the order that we're trying to fulfill.
But in the written plan, it would have to be something like implement.
Because we haven't implemented it yet. So that's exactly right, 100%. Where that's our intention, is to implement it.
Right. Because the other thing that came up here and in other places was the idea of police departments educating communities about hate crime legislation or those kinds of things. And I think you can, in light of Tina's point about more macro than micro, that can be blended into the community advisory committee. If you meet 4 times a year, 1 or 2 of those, or one part of that is a presentation. Mike's the use of force instructor. Maybe he just talks to people about this is what we're up against. This is how this works.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I definitely had that question come to mind of how much of is trying to define what are the roles of the department, and is community education of your policies one of your roles, or is that asking too much of the department? After reading all the policies, I was like, and seeing what your training schedule might be like, I was like, wow. But I know from personal experience when we were in Miami, having the police department down there come to our meetings to educate our family members and the community about procedure when a crisis call is brought in, helped so much in that relationship and helping families and a loved one understand why their response, an officer's response, might be the way it is and what their limitations are and all of that kind of stuff. So I can only imagine then that can extend into other areas of understanding in our community. And that to me and then trying to figure out, where does that fall? Is that a community relations thing? Is that under one of the other policies? Is that under like, or is that just going to be a statement that's going to be under a recommendation that we could be working on? You know what I mean?
No, and that's both good, all good points. We do everything from getting together with a Girl Scout troop to talk about personal safety, you know, for something like that. And then we have our use of force instructor who's gone into the schools and discussed, not necessarily under the use of force topic, but for immediate rapid deployment, what to do in the event of an active shooter, how we're going to react. And we found that was important after the shooting at Columbia, because the kids were very scared and intimidated by the SWAT team and the amount of people that came in and backed us up. We do a lot of that type of training. In addition to, we'll talk about to groups about domestic violence or neighborhoods about personal safety. So that could just be some additional topics that we offer out to the community, in addition to the schools or neighbors. So that's certainly a great idea.
I thought a good example of community education was mental health issues. Like, when do you call the police? There were, you know, and the policy is pretty good. I mean, it goes through a lot of that detail. And I think if more people knew about that, I don't know if it would mean more business, if more people would be calling, or maybe they'd be calling when they should be calling.
Right.
So there's that. Anybody else have anything else on this community relations? Okay, first off, I'd like to look at the use of force, because that's central to what this whole exercise is about in the eyes of the governor, in the eyes of the people who would judge police departments by the worst among them. And one of the things I have to say, after reading the use of force policy, I would not be a police officer if my life depended on it. There are 18 ways to fry somebody who, in the moment, was using their professional judgment. There are so many words like reasonable and imminent, and all of these standards where you're in a split second and the adrenaline is pumping. And to think that you could process eight or 10 pages of the specifics of a use of force policy, even with training, and I know we train on this stuff, it just scared me. And now I see why on CNN they can take any even borderline incident and turn it into something kind of terrible. And so the use of force one, again, to Tina's point, you don't want to get micro. I do think the definitions could be expanded, but I don't know how you do it. How do you define reasonable? You know, I know when the way it's written here is when people review what happened, they are reasonable people who would look at the situation and decide what would be a reasonable response. But there's no scientific standards for this stuff. And
I'm going to correct you a little bit on that, Jack. And generally speaking, when officers use force, it's not judged by what a reasonable person would do, but what a reasonable officer would do under those same circumstances. So you're gonna be judged by all what you just stated, all that influx of information and everything happening. And would another officer or a reasonable officer, is how the courts have defined it, react in a similar manner, in that same manner. And that's generally how the judgment goes. And the big, decision was that you're not going to be judged based on hindsight, based on what you knew after the facts.
Right.
You're being judged on what you knew at the time of the incident and at the time it happened.
Right.
One of the problems we have as a committee, see, a lot of things like the use of force, that's driven by law. And a lot of these things, for instance, reasonable, is defined in the criminal procedure law, that officers would know. We wouldn't, particularly. that's why I think it's important for us to stay macro. Because if we start looking at things like, well, what does reasonable mean? Well, it's defined someplace. You understand what I mean, Jack?
Yeah, and I'm
One
not
is
raising.
good. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm not raising that as a recommendation. At the moment, I'm just kind of responding as a person who read this really carefully a number of times and found myself feeling like, in some ways, the deck is a little bit stacked against police officers, and maybe as a society, that's what you want. But to John's correction, when you looked at that use of force review board stuff, that's police only reviewing that. And so one of the things that's happened nationally and with Cuomo and all of this is the idea of how do you bring non-police actors into that kind of conversation. And when I read this, I could see how having a person, maybe like in other places, they recommend the town board liaison, somebody like that who's a civilian, but not somebody who is a troublemaker or an activist, but to have somebody look and ask the questions that a non-police officer would ask. There's no doubt that the use of force review has to be conducted in-house. Your policies show that you have numerous layers of investigation when force is used. And the more serious the force, I assume, the more intensive the investigations. But the whole thrust of this national movement is that police can't police police.
And
exclusively.
And when police go against their own policies, they're not punished.
Right.
They go against their own policies.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not punished. I mean, you shoot somebody 21 times who's unarmed. You choke a guy to death.
Yeah.
What happens? The police they're not punished by civilian juries.
Right. Right. And look, I'm not proposing a civilian review board. I think those are very controversial. And I think a civilian review board is a very profound statement of a lack of confidence in your police department. And I'm not coming from there. And I wouldn't want that use of force review to be just anyone on it. But if the town board liaison could be on it, because it says that only two people ask the questions. The liaison doesn't even have to be the person asking questions. They can, just to be there as kind of, first off, protection. And second off, a different kind of perspective, a broader perspective on what happens, on how that's looked at. And
I have a question actually about we looked at the use of force policy, and then of course someone asked for I think Ingrid, you asked for the use of force board policy. And I was a little bit confused by the use of force board policy in terms of what seemed to be, and I'm sure there's some reason for this, and I just, I don't work for the police. I'm not sure, but it seemed very fungible. That review board seemed very like, sometimes it's comprised of these people and sometimes it's comprised of these other people, and there might be, and I don't know whether I just wasn't reading it correctly or I don't know, maybe
it would be dependent, I think, upon what the circumstances are. So we may have a different person on the review board if, say, a taser was used versus somebody who would be on the review board if a baton or OC was used. We might have a taser instructor be part of that review board because they're an expert in that field. So and probably help shape our policy on the usage of tasers. So we would want that person on the board to make sure that person followed training and followed policy, and could also probably provide all of the training records for that officer, that they attended those training and did so in in an acceptable fashion and passed all that stuff and everything. So I think I hope that answers your question, but it would probably be dependent upon what type of force was used and what officers we would involve in that, depending on what their expertise is and what maybe even a member from another agency, because we do use other agencies to teach our officers different things depending on what it is. It might be defensive tactics, it might be taser, it might be firearms, it could be use of OC pepper spray, all those things. So it would be comprised of different people because of the circumstances.
That does help, and that does make sense when you explain it that way. I think in its best form, that works really well, but maybe in its worst form, which hopefully we wouldn't have, but is some kind of review board policy that is so fungible that somebody could say, well, let's have, this guy and we'll have that gal on the review board because, we'll get the outcome we want, that's looking at the worst of things, right? But that kind of scared me a little bit when I read that, but I wasn't sure I understood completely either.
If I could just interject for one. So the use of force policy, we've obviously had a use of force policy for as long as I can say. The use of force review boards is a new one too. We have a supervisory meeting coming up next Wednesday. And that was one of our topics of discussion about establishing the core. Yes, like John said, we'll add in for specialties if someone's a content expert, but we're going to establish a core and have that in place going forward, whether it's a commitment for the year or whatever. So it's not constantly fluid. So it doesn't give that appearance of, oh, we're going to pick this person because this person is friends with this. So, and have it so it's going forward. And I certainly would not be opposed to having our police liaison, join us. I can assure her that, we're very fortunate that we don't have a high number of use of forces that come across. So it's not something that I would be bugging her every day about. I think John, because you did the reporting, we had 11 reportable.
Ask me now, and I don't have it.
I think it was 11.
Yeah, it wasn't that many. It was,
but it wasn't like hands-on use of force necessarily what you would, people think when they hear use of force, which we'll get into some of that data with you when we get into the data. But certainly,
Chief, that argues for making that a recommendation in the plan. You guys are getting it off the ground.
That's exactly why we
drafted the policy.
Yeah, we chose to keep this one. It was something new to us. We just, as we're going through, it's been a process for the year. And this is something with the reform, we looked around and this was something that came up that we thought would be great again, that we could add. And that's in-house. It's not a lot of, primarily in-house with staffing. So it would be logistically would work.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and just to be clear, when I said that this use of force would make me not want to be a police officer, I do think this policy is very well written. I think within the confines of what you're dealing with, I think that when I saw John and the chief last week, and I had just read the bias-based policy, which to me was one of the most boring stringing together of words I've ever read in my whole life. And so I made a crack about how boring these policies are, but then I read the use of force, and that was not boring. That was highly enlightening. The bias-based policing one I thought was just pap. What else can you do?
I'm sorry, Chief, go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
What's important to say too, it is very well written, and the reason it is because you have the guidelines of all of these laws that are applicable to it. So you have the federal guidelines, you have the state guidelines, you have your accreditation standards, you have your best practices. This is, when you look through this, you'll see what applies where, and some of them are multiple. Some might be federal, state, and accreditation standards. So that policy is based off of all of those things. And that's your guide to make sure you're following it properly. And it's written that way because it's laid out that way for you almost automatically.
It's very nicely put together, though. It's somebody said it earlier, every time you turn a corner, the next thing you're looking for is exactly what you want to find there. So I thought that was great. But again, Tina, this goes back to, and I think, Tina, I think you and I differ on the policies, because as we talk about these, the things in these policies that are new or that are going to be implemented could be critical to a plan that allows us to be consistent with the ideology of the police department. And, you know, because they're great ideas. I don't know in total if it's too much to expect the department to do all of it. But I think, Chief and John, if there's other places you could point out to us without us having to read all the policies of things that are new or things that you're trying out or things you want to implement, because there's nothing better than putting together a plan that says we've started down this road, and then it's a plan where we actually could do what we say we're going to do. Because
Right.
I fear this, I don't want this to be a cosmetic exercise where we have to do it. It's required by the executive order, and we're just spinning our wheels. I think a really interesting case could be made for the East Greenbush Police Department and how progressive we are with some of the things that you're adding. You know, because you guys have heard you've heard all the national discussion. You've seen 50A be repealed, and, you know, all the laws that came in. So maybe you could just take a look and see if you could compile even just a short list of
Absolutely.
things.
I think
like
you'll
that.
see as we go through this, we've already kind of started talking about that. These were actually just fortunate that they were in this policy because they're things we had discussed. We did have a conversation. Roger had submitted a suggestion, which I think in regards to the reporting of use of force, which is something we can tweak in here. In regards to the chief's office notification, our process is that, you know, they do the use of force form, it goes to a supervisor, it goes to our use of force instructor, and then it comes to the chief's office, because just that's the way it's always been done. But it's not really spelled out. So Roger had suggested, and correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, like tightening it up a little bit so it spells it out in here, so that you know, when I'm long gone or the use of force instructor is long gone, you know, we understand that that's how it needs to be handled. You know, and it gives us that checks and balances too, so that it does go through multiple hands that can review it. So that was one recommendation that was made to us that we have since we meet tomorrow with our Lexipol consultant. And so when we do that, we will send you the updated use of force policy again, so that we'll have that noted in there as well.
But I think also because the use of force policies are so central to this whole debate and are so central to Andrew wanting to reform and reinvent, I think we're in good shape because this policy is very well done.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that in a plan, you know, if we do the overview of the police department right, or we work this into recommendations, I think we should take credit for being out in front on an issue that's really important.
Another thing we can do is DCGS has started collecting all the data that John submits for use of forces for us, for our department, and they're going to do an annual report. And when we spoke, John and I were speaking that at the end of the year, what we can put on our annual report that I do and provide to you, Jack, and the town board, but we can also include a link to that so the community can access that, and it breaks it. What we see, we're not sure what it's going to look like yet. The public sees, but we can make sure that our use of force data is out there annually as well, so that it's there for someone if they're interested. You know, we're very happy. You know, numbers could always be lower. Obviously, 0 is the ideal number, but in some instances, unfortunately, our job doesn't allow that. You know, because everyone is not happy to see us, shockingly. So, but these are things that, you know, we thought about putting. You know, that can go on our site as well. So.
Okay. Anybody want to talk about any other policies?
It was Robin, did you want to touch anything on crisis intervention? I'm guessing.
I do. I was trying to get my
okay.
mute off.
I figured.
There was like just a couple of, it's a really, like Jack was saying about use of force, it's is a great written policy.
I was interested to see your opinion on this.
No, I did. And, there were a couple of things that just like jumped out at me when I loved the sentence even when I did my rubric, in the definitions, including, the part of the sentence that said, including an increase in symptoms of mental illness despite treatment compliance. I loved that that's in there because that's just such an educated, perspective to have. I was wondering about the agency's use of mobile crisis, and do you guys? And I looked on the website, the East Greenwich Police Department website. Would it be helpful to list Northern Rivers mobile crisis on there? And that's also another education piece, because that's a piece where if someone doesn't understand and the community doesn't understand what that role is, and that's part of what NAMI tries to do, we try to educate also. That's part of our role and responsibility, the community, about using mobile crisis, when you can call mobile crisis, when you should call for emergency response from the police. But so I was wondering about that. And I also know that New York Connects has a mobile crisis, but I didn't know if they were only Albany County and if they came across the river. I was wondering about training for the dispatch call receivers, how they're trained. Do they, where was it? It was about getting a known mental illness history. Are they trained in part of your program to know what kinds of questions to ask to get the best information, to get it to the officer who is responding? I'm just throwing out questions.
Yeah,
These were just
so
things that
let me
came
just
to
answer
mind.
that. Yeah, before you
Yeah.
move on. So yes, so our dispatchers go through different training for all sorts of different things, but with Police One that we recently signed on to, and actually I think the last one they just was bomb threats, and I think the next one up is again. There's all sorts of 1 hour trainings that the dispatchers are getting for emotionally distressed persons, mental health calls, and a lot of times in our CAD system, we'll have the addresses flagged with information already from after the officers were there 1 or 2 times. We gathered information, so that information, once we verify it's the same individual, is automatically shared to our officers, not necessarily over the radio, but we have the zone phones. They'll call in and remind the officers if someone has a certain trigger. We used to have a gentleman in town off of Sherwood Avenue that, would always become argumentative and would be holding a knife, but never menacing us with it. But it was his security. So things that we learned over time, how to respond to certain houses. So yes, yes for training we're getting.
Yep.
Our officers, some of them were just sent to, it's the EDPRT, emotionally distressed person response team training. Troy hosted it. It was a week-long course, and they're going to host it again in the spring and the fall in conjunction with Rensselaer County Mental Health. So we sent a few officers. We're sending more in the spring and more in the fall. Unfortunately, I can't send them all at once. So it'll probably take a year and a half probably to get everybody through it. But from the feedback we got, and I say sent them, they did it virtually, sorry. So, but they really thought it was an excellent training and something that we were afforded the opportunity to do this year. So,
is that, how long is that training? Is it
it was for the week.
So
40 hours.
So it's similar to CIT, because CIT is a 40-week training.
Is it 40 hour?
Cool.
So we did that.
That's excellent.
In addition to online training for the officers.
That would be one of the other questions I had about if the department had specific officers that, I know it's a small department and that typically respond to your
no, because at any given time there's the 3 shifts, so we can't ever guarantee.
That was
that someone would be on call unless the town supervisor wants to consider that in the next contract negotiation.
And then my other, and this is, I'll just quickly add, I was wondering about, even though it's more an intellectual disability, the autism spectrum disorder. If we don't, I noticed in any of the policies, even in bias-based or in this, there was no notice of awareness or a training specifically in response to that. And
There is,
if that works for you guys, if you already,
absolutely.
you know, don't need a recommendation for that.
No, we certainly would take any recommendations. You know, every officer, we had touched on different topics throughout the police academy, but for some of us, it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And we have tried to have content experts, you know, as such as yourself, who came in with NAMI to give us an oversight or overview for different topics during our legal update training. So we're always looking for people to bring in for the shared services team for all the police agencies that can speak to any of these topics. It's always nice to get the person to person when we can again, as opposed to just online.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, and it'd probably be a really big bite to chew, but there's some, it could be a town police project or something. There's a great program getting wallet cards out to folks on the autism spectrum, especially, you know, if you have a young adult who's beginning to drive or things like that, that would be a neat thing. I don't know if that'd be more of a county program or something, but I don't know. Could be a community relations thing.
Absolutely.
That'd be doing any Screenbush.
I love that.
And
I do too.
so maybe that could go in a recommendation. And my last thing that I have so many highlights. Let me tell you, when I went through this, I loved some of the things it said, but I really loved and appreciated that under supervisor responsibilities, 408.8F, which is evaluate whether a critical incident, stress management, debriefing is involved for involved members is warranted. So you're making sure that your officers are being taken care of and recognizing that these situations, walking into these, can be also cause a lot of stress and emotional distress for someone who's trying to manage it. So bravo. That's wonderful to see that in the policy. Those are just
Robin, let me just throw in there. I think that one of the things that runs through all of this is that you need a wellness program for police officers, trauma counseling, this kind of stuff, because
There's
I would also, do you mind if I jump in for a second? Because like, can I connect those two thoughts? Because when you said wallet cards, another thing that I've seen that's really helpful is if you have wallet cards for police too, that have like a laminated little card that has like mental health resources or something like that. So it's really easy to access. It's easy to kind of give people information and stuff like that.
You can work with NAMI Capital Region can help get some grant money to put those together for you guys if you want to partner with
what
us.
I'll do is I will scan it and share it with you tomorrow. We have a laminated 5x7 card in all our vehicles. And on it, it has different resources, not just for that type of things, but it's also for substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence, homelessness. So we have a card, and actually John and I were just talking yesterday about adding a few other options onto it and relaminating them. So, but I'll share with you what we have. It's pretty extensive. I have to say, give credit to Officer Ashley who put that together for us. So when we had them put into the cars, maybe 5 months ago or so now. So they're in the glove boxes for everybody officer to have. So if someone wants to screenshot or copies to be handed out to people if need be. So to touch Jack on the wellness, there's a program called the Asher model that we've kind of been looking at. And it has the different points as far as awareness, peer support, healthy habits, like resiliency, family. spirituality, and I think it says solution focused approach. So this is something that we've been kind of playing with to share with the committee that going forward, and talked about maybe partnering with YMCA or Planet Fitness or something for the physical fitness aspect of it, since we don't really have room for a gym in our station at this time. So
Always selling, aren't you?
throwing it out there, sir.
Oh, and well, by the way, Elaine, the comprehensive plan update has get a new police station in it. So that's good
Thank
for you. One last thing on from me on the crisis intervention is it says that the chief of police will collaborate with mental health professionals to develop an education and response protocol. Do we have that, or is that something we could
We can certainly expand that. We did meet with Webster County Mental Health, the Chiefs panel did, in regards to some of the mobile crisis information and the training that our officers attended. So they're there as a resource, and we asked them to come into that, but certainly something we can expand on.
And in fairness, this is another example of what I'm saying is that we could recommend an awful lot of these things, but you need the person power and the bandwidth to actually carry them out. So that some kind of priorities would have to be established.
I would also just jump in as like a mental health provider, the idea of compliance, because I'm a social worker too. Sometimes the idea of compliance like doesn't sit well with me, because there's compliance, but there's also like access to treatment, and there's a lot of people really suffering right now. And I think there's an overall lack of community resources, and there's a lack of crisis resources, and there's a lack of like crisis continuum of care. So communication between different, different treatment resources. So it's not always like compliance. Sometimes it's access, or it's economic ability to pay for like expensive medications and stuff like that. So I just wanted to say that as well.
Okay. Anything else on this policy? All right. So what I would propose here is, I know I'm collecting notes on these kinds of things that could be recommendations. Chief, if you and maybe John could help with this, look at the policies and kind of give us a short list of kind of important new things you want to do or are in the process of organizing.
Certainly.
And then go ahead.
We started drafting something for you. So we'll get that to you shortly for some of these different subjects. So
yeah, because I think that's really helpful, and it marches us down a path we've already laid out, and therefore we're not adding too much to what you're trying to do, or how you're trying to augment your programs now.
Okay.
The next thing I had on the agenda was training. I got this list from the chief today, and I sent it out. I don't know if everybody's seen it, but so maybe what we should do is take a look at that list for next week. But can we talk for a bit about how we're going to, what we need to know about training? How do you want to approach the issue of training? Because it almost seems obvious that a plan could be 10 new forms of training. Let's train in this, let's train in that, let's do that. But again, there's very serious budgetary constraints on training where, Chief and I go through this at budget time. But how should, as a group, and as a plan, how do you want to approach training? Any thoughts?
Do you want us to take some of the main topics from the police reform and tell you some of the courses we've taken that apply to those topics and how many hours or minutes or whatever it may be? Would that be a good starting point for you to look at? Because I know just the names themselves might be foreign language to you on some of the.
Yeah.
Because some aren't really applicable.
Chief, say that again, what you were proposing there?
So basically, John and I kind of already went through a little bit and looked at the executive order and some of the topics that were noted in there. And then we looked to see what trainings that we do annually and that we've done since we caught wind the executive order was coming, if we didn't already have some training in those areas. And maybe we could break it down that way and show you how much we have done or where we need to improve on for training, whether it's in person or online. That might help kind of, some training on this list is not applicable to the executive order, but it is our training that we get. So
yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And I think, you know, again, in the report, when we do an overview of the police department, one of the things we do in there is emphasize our training program, which the accreditation panel called robust. I called it expensive.
He likes that word.
But that's different. But I think that's a good idea, because I do think, you know, look, I once went over with Chris Lav and I said, just tell me which of these trainings are mandatory. And he said, I already did. And I said, so they all are mandatory. Is that the point? And he said, yes. So,
If I could just jump in here, I think it's going to be really helpful to understand the topics that you're trained on, but I also think it's helpful to understand the providers that deliver the training, because, you know, as we've heard from Robin and Ingrid, there are community-based providers that don't always necessarily provide training to police departments about the technical aspects of your job, but they might be able to provide training on those adaptive aspects of your job, those ways to respond to people, those ways to develop you know, an understanding of what somebody who has a specific perspective is going through. So I think it's important to understand not only the topics, but the various providers. And then also, how do we evaluate to see if the training makes that change in knowledge and understanding that we hope it does? You know, do the trainers that you employ conduct any evaluations to see if after attending this training and participating in this training, you've gained, you know, X, Y, and Z that you're supposed to?
And without, off the top of my head, some will do a pre-test, a post-test type of evaluation. I can't speak to which one. Some will just do a review at the end, in writing, for asking us what we feel we've learned or what that they can improve upon. That's something I'll have to coordinate with Officer Kondo as the training coordinator to see. Our online training is interactive, some of it. So, and there's assessments throughout with a test at the end. So that is probably the easiest gauge when we have the test at the end, that you can't get your certificate. You can't print up your certificate until you pass the test. So it's hard though to gauge.
It is. It's very hard to gauge, and there's many companies that are employed just to do that. So you know, it's very difficult. I do just want to quickly, to Supervisor Conway, time check. We do have
7:15.
Right. This is typically when we admit people from the waiting room. Obviously, we're not done with our agenda, so we can admit those people, but I think we should continue on with our business, and then when we're done, open it up for public comment.
Yes, so what you're saying, Taylor, admit everyone in the waiting room. We'll continue our conversation, and hopefully shortly we'll announce public comment, and then people can speak. But let's have them come in if they're here. While we have this conversation, because I don't want to leave people in the waiting room past 7:15.
I like the idea of that you presented, Chief, of a way to sort of, you know, jump us into the training with taking a look at what seems to be pertinent and addressing that. And I also think we'll want to, if we're going to be talking about any of the policies that were reviewed and making recommendations specific to those policies, we would want to also hone in on, you know, whatever training was required by that policy that we looked at.
Absolutely. Pretty much in the last line of, or last section of every policy, it's the training. So that'll which helps. So.
Okay, any other comments on training?
I would just say I was amazed at how many trainings there already are. So not duplicating, if you're already covering stuff in the trainings, you know, I can see the officers rolling their eyes at the idea of having another training because there seems to be a lot. And I don't know if you could speak to that, but.
There's way more than there used to be, most certainly. I'll be honest. It's something that I was always thinking that we do our legal updates, we do all our regular in-person trainings, but with online trainings becoming more and more popular over the years, it was something that I definitely had in my mind when I became, if and when I became chief, that's something we should implement, because it's always good to have the ongoing. Some skills, you don't use, you lose. So we certainly do a lot, and we try to space it out, especially now that we're also putting out all our policies to the officers. So, if we give them a training, they have a couple weeks to do it, so that it's not that feeling of, oh, here they come again. So I'm sure they appreciate your comment, Ingrid.
Chief, do you
No,
notice?
please go ahead.
Do you notice a big difference in how the officers respond or dispatchers respond to training, like a lot, like different learning styles? Like I could see some people really responding to the online thing. Some people just do well with in person, right in front of you. Has it been more difficult during the pandemic at all to not have in-person training for some folks, or is it working out okay?
I think some trainings are perfectly good to do online. I think sometimes when you go to somewhere, I feel like content experts might feel, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it because I talk a lot. I know town supervisor will attest to that. But, sometimes you can actually get the content you really need in an hour training, but they feel obligated to give you 3 hours of it. And that's where, you tend to lose someone's attention. So I think a lot of these trainings work out perfect, having them online and interactive, where you can't just walk away and leave it playing. You have to interact. There's maybe a video, there's different scenarios you can follow, but certainly some trainings definitely have to be accomplished in person, and those are ones that we are mandatory, our felony traffic stops, our taser training, our firearms training, things like that.
Thanks.
John, jump in here, John, because you've done a lot of training.
Just to add to that, I think that you're going to see a lot of the training that we're talking about that pertains to this order play out in all of our other trainings also. So, we talked about firearms training, taser training, high-risk vehicle stops, defensive tactics. Well, now, not just now, but has been for some time, but now more than ever, you get the things like your de-escalation tactics are brought up in these trainings also. So, I just listed 4 or 5 different trainings that an officer might have in a month time. Those are 4 or 5 times where they're also going to have that de-escalation training brought up and talked about and implemented in scenarios. We do a lot of scenario-based training, particularly with things like active shooter and stuff like that, where we actually physically go out and chase somebody around the schools and all the things that are involved in that. We take over Columbia High School every winter, and use it while the kids are off on break. So all of those things, there are scenarios, I think one of the questions on a survey was shoot, don't shoot scenarios in the range. Well, that's mandated. We do those all the time. That's not just something we think about. It's something that we have to do. It's mandated by case law for training. So a lot of these things play out throughout all of our different kinds of trainings. And now we do the EDPRT training that we just talked about earlier. Well, of course, that's going to involve de-escalation tactics and techniques, because that's the whole point of the training, is to learn how to gain confidence and get these folks to do what we need them to do in order to have a safe outcome without anybody getting hurt. So all of this stuff plays out as throughout the year in all of our training. It just may not be emphasized because that training isn't just specific to that, but it is brought up throughout.
Mm-hmm. That's also good, John, when a lot of these things are components in another kind of training, you're not multiplying the number of training sessions. You know, you're just sharpening the focus. Okay, anybody else? So Chief, what are we going to do about training since all the assignments seem to be falling on you?
We'll get that to you shortly.
Okey-doke. Okay, and then the next and probably the last thing we'll talk about before we open it up is data. And what I'd like to propose is that I will do an inventory of data. And I'll do it in the next couple of days, hopefully. Well, not tomorrow, but after tomorrow. And what I'll do is I'll just sit down with Chief and John and say, you know, what kind of data do we have? We'll go downstairs. We'll look at everything we've gotten so far, and we'll just do an inventory. There you go. There you go.
Waiting
But
for you.
I'll take that off your desk. So,
Put a
but-
sticky note right on it with your name.
well, we have a meeting coming up, so bring it with you and get
Will
ready
do.
to explain it to me.
Fair enough.
But what I'll do is I'll get the data. We'll do an inventory, and then next week we'll talk about how we want to analyze this and how we want to present it. And Tina doesn't want everyone to know this, but she's a professional at this, so she's gonna have some, whether I want it or not, she's gonna have something to say about, and that is as it should be. That works for everyone? Okay, let's open it up. I see Andrea Smith. Andrea, do you want to say anything?
Sure, I wasn't really sure if it was a public meeting.
Yes, yes.
I think it's interesting to hear you talk about training, but honestly, the best defense against unnecessary use of force for people who are victims of domestic violence or people who are disabled is to develop a crisis response program that just reduces or eliminates the encounters between law enforcement and those at-risk individuals. So rather than spending more time training on de-escalation, because the balance is never going to be the same between the hours of weapons training, which averages 60 hours a year, and the average of crisis intervention training, which averages about 8 hours a year. That's a national statistic. You know, so your training, you know, Malcolm Gladwell's theory of perfection, 10,000 hours of repetition will make you very good at something, but you're never going to get as good at weapons as you are at de-escalation. And so rather than focusing too much on trying to beef up that aspect, it does make more sense to figure out how East Greenbush or the County of Rensselaer can access sufficient interventions other than law enforcement response. So you were talking about the dispatch training. You know, maybe it's not police dispatch for certain circumstances. Maybe it is Northern Rivers or other resources that we can identify or develop as part of an implementation plan. I'm not saying it's going to happen this year, but it does seem that there should be other tactics that could be considered as opposed to just more training for crisis intervention, because the police are never going to be as expert as other people would be at that.
Ingrid, I saw you shaking your head up and down. Do you want to jump in?
I mean, I've worked in some different places that had different structural solutions for crisis systems. And I think, you know, part of the problem is you drop someone off at an emergency room and that really doesn't solve the underlying problem or provide like a high level of mental health care. And, you know, I think there's some innovative things you can do. I work one place where I'm a social worker by training, and there was a social worker who went with a police officer on different kinds of calls. They worked together. And I worked in Kansas City where they had a really interesting crisis center where the police could bring people who were distressed so they could kind of de-escalate it and be in a safe place. So I think just echoing the idea of like having those systems, analyzing those systems, seeing what's working, understanding, I don't know, maybe you have something really awesome in place and it's working fine and there isn't a need. I don't know. But I think there are interesting different things you can do. So.
You know, the most effective intervention often is a peer, you know, because they are a certified peer, someone who has lived experience, can really relate to what is happening. And, you know, certainly less expensive than a clinical social worker. But, you know, just because, you know, we talk about it all the time. What are the adverse childhood experiences that make children develop coping mechanisms that ruin them for the rest of their lives? You know, the adverse childhood experiences are having a family member witnessing violence in the home, having a family member incarcerated, having a family member who is a substance user. And so, you know, rather than adding to a traumatic experience when you respond to a domestic violence call, you know, people need to understand that the children in that home are going to witness additional violence depending on how the interaction is handled. And, you know, it's really tough to know what the right answer is, but I think if you're going to spend any time on police reform, that acknowledging the difficulty of these circumstances and the need for modernization. You know, we've had centuries of the same response, and it really is time to figure out alternatives. And so I think just going back to, as opposed to training, going back to triaging at the dispatch level, making sure that accessing the mental health services or the domestic violence services isn't a do-it-yourself project. You know, it's fine to have the resources on a card, but if you give the card to the person to call, you know, that's probably not going to get the job done, just like dropping someone off at the emergency room won't get the job done. So, you know, it's just a level deeper in terms of the response. And I'm not saying it's the police department's job to, you know, do the warm handoff. I'm just questioning whether there is a more comprehensive component to crisis response where the town is actively engaged in the resources that NAMI can identify, that I might be able to help identify. You know, Northern Rivers is on my board of directors for my mental health association. But there seems to be the need for this to be a deeper conversation, just given the time that we're living in, and the fact that COVID is exacerbating substance use and overdoses and violence and depression and anxiety.
Andrea, I agree with virtually everything you said. I mean, there's some really good ideas in there. I do question in the beginning when you compare the number of hours of training on the shooting range to this, because I think they're separate. Somebody could argue that the police spend too much time training with their guns, but they really don't. And what that does is keep our officers safe, and it keeps the public safe. So I just wouldn't put them in the same context. But everything else you said,
I think my comparison was more, Jack, about the fact that the weapons training is done, you know, it goes to the what you're comfortable with, right? So you are going to be expert at your weapons training. You may not feel as confident about your de-escalation and crisis intervention training because it's not as much.
Yeah, there's no doubt that that's true.
If I could just interject, just so everyone's aware, we do training twice a year for firearms, for our handguns and our rifles in the spring and in the fall. So that's 16 hours of training, and then whatever any officer chooses to do on themselves. But that's what's required by DCJS for us. So in addition, and I agree with a lot that you said, Andrea, as well. We certainly, as a police department, would love to have our own personal a team. When and they came in to do a speaking with us. Rivers came in to speak with us. Ideally, that would be perfect for us. We would love that as police officers, because we know we only have so much training, but we also learn by doing, and we are doing a lot of de-escalation every day in our job, more so than we are doing firearms instruction. So even though we may not have the content specialty that maybe a specialist would have, I will say, having dealt with some people that have that, I feel like we do a lot more de-escalating sometimes than they may even do on a regular basis, because we're dealing with it on pretty much a majority of our calls we go on in one sense or another. In addition to the domestic violence calls, the families, unfortunately, it's a lot of repeat families we deal with. So they get to know us, and we're fortunate that we're in a small community. So our people do get to know us, and a lot of times they ask for officers by a certain name. And obviously our biggest issue is we certainly don't want to traumatize any children in the home or anything like that. So, but I think because, we do have a very high call volume for a police agency of our size, we do get that exposure, maybe not for formal trainings above and beyond what we get through what we're doing that we talked about earlier, but hands-on training. And I think that goes very far in life and dealing. So I would be remiss in not saying that, because I'm very proud of our officers and how they do handle situations. And I think that can be shown by the amount of calls that we do take for mental health arrests based on what our use of force numbers are. So I would, that's all. I just wanted to share that.
And I just want to build upon what the chief is saying too, because she and I have had conversations about programs such as the Handle with Care program. When they notice a child in a situation of trauma, they have a connection to the school district, not only by the presence of the school resource officer at Columbia High School, but the relationship that the staff have with the police department. And that communication is essential, and there are structures in place that's happening.
One of our things we do is the morning and the afternoon for dismissals that we started doing for the schools and our East Greenbush schools and Holy Spirit, barring any emergency calls. And I have to say, in hearing from some of the officers already and some of the parents or phone calls I've gotten, it's helped a lot on certain domestic violence calls our guys have been on, because the kids recognize our officers as that friendly face in the morning saying hi. So not really in line with the helping with the mental health aspect, but just as far as the comfort level for the kids.
Albany, the committee in Albany had a subcommittee on crisis intervention. And they did a short program on public broadcasting about their recommendation for a public service agency. Now, I heard it in the radio, and I think it would be worth us looking at. I don't know if it's applicable, but it may be worth giving it a look. It talked about having a mental health professional dispatch with patrol, and operationally, I don't know how that's going to work. But I'll try to find it online. Maybe somebody else can look too. It's the Albany Police Reform Committee on Crisis Intervention.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, next week, same time, same place, 6 p.m. Tuesday. Everybody good?
If everyone would just, some of the ideas I took notes, but in case I missed anything, if some of the recommendations for the policies that you reviewed individually, if you don't mind sharing that with the committee, that way I can make sure as we're looking at them, and we can just compile a list. That would be helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. Enjoy your frozen, snowy Tuesday night. But thank you, everyone. So
I know, and just a quick, poor Aaron doesn't get a snow day tomorrow. He has to do virtual.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you see, some parts of this are good. I mean, honestly, tonight I did not want to go down to town hall for a meeting, and here we
Nice.
are. Yeah. So
Can I just ask Aaron quick before we sign off? Aaron, what did you think about the policies?
I thought I didn't have many opinions because I thought they were laid out really well. It was tough to come up with anything that I thought was not right in a sense.
Or covered some way? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious what your opinion was. Thank you.
yeah, Aaron doesn't get into enough trouble. So
Right. We got to pick more of a hoodlum next time to be on the committee with
yeah,
us.
that's not Aaron. So
Jack,
So he
thank DPW for us tonight, okay?
yeah, they're out. We first up, we got all 8 snow plows humming.
Yeah, they're
And the
going
guy-
by.
The guys are out there doing great.
Yeah, tell them
All right.
thank you.
I will do that. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.